Hello, everyone. Welcome to SolarFest, the virtual version. I'm Pete O'Connor with Plug in America. This is my, I believe, fourth year at SolarFest. As I was saying, each time it's been a different place, and this year it's in my attic. But hope you're all staying well in this time. And we're glad to talk about clean transportation, with a particular focus on electric vehicles, but we'll also discuss other clean transportation options and what Vermont and the neighboring states are doing on clean transportation and EVs, and what someone's captured the screen here. Okay, and then what the options are for the future, what the outlook is for the future, and how we can recover from this COVID-induced recession and pandemic, and have EVs come back stronger than ever. So we have three speakers today, in addition to myself. I'm the moderator. We have Dave Roberts from VEIC, who will talk about what Vermont is doing. We have Adam Ruder from NYSERDA, who can talk about New York's efforts on EVs and clean transportation. And we have Dan Gatti from the state of Massachusetts. We'll have each of them give a short talk, then I'll ask some questions as moderator, and then we'll turn it over to general audience Q&A. So without further ado, let's go to Dave Roberts from VEIC.
All right, thank you, Pete, and thanks to the SolarFest folks. And hopefully you're seeing my screen. See nodding, great. So my name's Dave Roberts. I work for VEIC. We're a nonprofit based in Burlington, Vermont, and we coordinate the Drive Electric Vermont program. And that is a public-private partnership working to advance transportation electrification in the state. And we act on several fronts, and a few that I'll mention today are doing consumer outreach and education. So back in the pre-COVID days, we might be doing these in person with some EV owners and getting people behind the wheel to have some firsthand experience. But this summer, we're obviously moving to more online opportunities, so grateful to be able to share some today. We're also supporting the state of Vermont's state incentive program right now. I'll talk a little more about that. We're working on developing more charging infrastructure in the state, both public, workplace, and helping out with some folks who are maybe in multifamily dwellings that have some more challenges with getting charging installed. And we coordinate a stakeholder program. So we have quarterly stakeholder meetings that involve people from the state of Vermont, electric utilities, other nonprofits and environmental organizations, and basically get together and try to think about ways to advance our work in the state. And on the right, that's me and my Bolt. That's actually my third EV. So I've had two Nissan Leafs, and now I've been driving a Bolt, and my lease is up in December, so I got to start thinking about what I'm going to be doing. And that's our dog, Rosalita, in the backseat driver. So just going to run through a few slides and then look forward to some Q&A. I want to call people's attention to our website, driveelectricvt.com. This is one of the tools on our website that allows you to explore the different EV models that are available today in Vermont. So you can filter by the different types, so all electric versus plug-in hybrid that can run on battery and gasoline, their electric range, whether they have all-wheel drive, which is something a lot of Vermonters and other folks in the Northeast care deeply about for winter driving, the price, and then also if they're eligible for the state of Vermont incentive program. Not every vehicle sold in the state is, because there are some price caps on that program. So this is just showing what that tool looks like. You can click on a vehicle to see a little bit more detail on the specifics, including the amount of the federal tax credit, which is another incentive that many EVs are currently eligible for. A few of the newer models that maybe aren't on our website yet because they haven't quite made it into sales rooms or your online websites yet are shown here. The Tesla Model Y is available, and that is shipping now. I know there's at least a handful of them already in Vermont, and that's their sort of smaller crossover style vehicle. It comes with all-wheel drive. The Ford Mustang Mach-E is one that's supposed to be coming out later this year. the Ford Escape plug-in hybrid, another one due out sometime this year. That's going to be all of what you see on the screen will at least have all-wheel drive as an option, but the Ford Escape will be front-wheel drive. That's the exception. The Volkswagen ID.4 is supposed to be shipping later this year, and that's a concept, so they haven't actually shown the final version of that. And then the Toyota RAV4 Prime, be a plug-in hybrid with about somewhere around 35 or 40 miles of range. So expect that those all to be of high interest to people who live in places where they need more ground clearance and potentially all-wheel drive or better driving in snow. Some of the other electric options, just to make sure everybody's aware of, and these may vary depending on where you live, but we do have electric buses. So this is one that's already on the road in Burlington, and there are several more coming in different parts of the state, both electric school and transit. Got electric bikes. There's some great incentives on electric bikes right now that utilities are offering in Vermont. Got some more information on those on our website. We even have electric car sharing in the Burlington area, electric lawn care equipment, mowers. They're great, no gas, very easy to use. This is a commercial style mower shown on the bottom left, but obviously there are home models too. And electric motorcycles, which are, from what I understand, a blast to drive. So something important.
Dave, can you just go back
Yes.
a few slides? We have a question in the group chat that's probably easy to address right now, which is which of these are all electric? And I know you mentioned the plug-in hybrids, so if you just quickly note.
Yep. So the Tesla Model Y, the Ford Mustang Mach-E, and the VW ID.4, the all electrics, and then the Ford Escape and Toyota RAV4, the plug-in hybrids.
Thank you.
Yep. Something important to keep in mind as you're thinking about winter conditions, cold weather does impact the battery range of these vehicles. So depends on the vehicle and how you operate it. If you're able to use heated seats and steering wheels, or maybe the vehicle has a more efficient heat pump heating system as opposed to an electric resistance heater, it'll be more efficient than otherwise, but you can expect on the coldest winter days to see a reduction up to 40, even 50% in some cases. So important to factor that in when you have an EV that's getting over 200, almost, some of them are over 300 now that we're looking at, and battery technology is improving, so it's maybe less of an issue moving forward, but at least as of today, it's important to just keep in mind that you will see less range in the winter. So might mean if you're on the bubble of having range for your daily needs, you might think about a plug-in hybrid or going with another model that has a little more range if that's a concern to you. The state of Vermont has been offering a state incentive program since last December. It was changed a little bit about two or three weeks ago. So I just want to call people's attention that if maybe you saw that launch in December and you saw you weren't eligible, that it has changed a little bit to be based on the income caps that the state set. Instead of being based on household income, are now based on your adjusted gross income on your tax return. And so there are different sort of categories depending on how you file your taxes, but for most people, it's probably individual, which is the first row, or the third row, which would be married filing jointly. And there are different incentive amounts depending on your income. So if it's less than $50,000 adjusted gross income, you get a higher incentive. It's basically almost, well, it is double for a plug-in hybrid, so it's $3,000 versus $1,500 for this sort of standard incentive. And then $4,000 for an all-electric vehicle if your income is below $50,000 versus $2,500 if you're just getting the standard incentive. And the standard incentive is for folks who are making more than $50,000 but up to $100,000. So that's the limit. If your adjusted gross income and your filing is over $100,000, you're filing singly, you're not eligible for a state of Vermont incentive at this time. If you're filing jointly, that cap is raised to $125,000. So it's for vehicles with a base price under $40,000. So vehicles can cost more than that with options and things like that. So any Tesla Model 3 is eligible since the base Model 3 is under $40,000. And there's about $330,000 remaining in the program. The state was all set to The legislators were talking about adding more funds earlier this year, and then COVID hit, and there's a lot of budget uncertainty. So we're not really sure what that may mean for the future of this program. So if you're interested in taking advantage, I highly recommend you do so in the near term while this funding is available, because we're not sure if more funding is coming or not. And just to kind of run down what that incentive and other incentives combined can mean for a purchase of an EV. This is admittedly a fairly basic EV that we're talking about, the Nissan Leaf, which has a 150-mile range for the base model these days. The starting suggested retail price is $31,600. And I've shown kind of two scenarios if you're eligible for kind of the standard incentives versus if you're eligible for the less than $50,000 income incentives. And subtracting out the federal tax credit, which the Leaf is still eligible for the full $7,500. There's the $2,500 state incentive, or $4,000 for lower income. Nissan has a discount program from the manufacturer that'll take another $3,000 off. And then there are electric utility incentives, and sort of an average utility incentive in Vermont right now is about $1,500 off. And if you're low income, oftentimes utilities will give you a little more. So that'd be $2,500. So you're talking about anywhere from a little over 17,000 to 14,600 for a brand new Nissan Leaf. So some really good deals, and compared to, say, like a Nissan Sentra, which might be a kind of similar vehicle, it's actually several $1,000s less. So when you kind of package all these incentives together, EVs can be a much better deal than most folks realize. And that's my presentation. So I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists are sharing today, and talking a little bit more and answering questions.
Thank you, Dave. We have a couple of comments we can get to afterwards in the Q&A portion. I see Dave Kana responding to the heating aspect of the range decrease in winter. You can use a heated steering wheel and heated seats, which are great options unless you have kids in the car seats, which I tend to have. But the cabin heat is what really costs you a lot of that range in the winter. So finding alternatives, whether it's bundling up, using the heated steering wheel, can really get you back a lot of that range you would lose. That's a good tip for Vermont. Moving on.
The battery management systems and the battery heating and cooling systems do have a lot to do with it as well. I have a Nissan Leaf, and Nissan's batteries are air cooled, and I find that they lose a lot more range in the winter than some other models do.
That's true. I had a test where I was blasting the heat full blast because it was a polar vortex and I had kids in car seats. So, I lost a lot of range in that trip, but, they have pretty good battery management for the most part. All right, let's go to Adam now to talk about New York. Adam,
great, thanks, Pete. And I didn't put slides together. I wanted to just kind of keep it more informal, but thanks for having me. Thank you, Mike, for being a great organizer and host for all these years, and I'm glad I was able to participate. I am the head of the transportation program at NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. For those of you who aren't familiar with NYSERDA, we are the state energy office. We fund a lot of research and development projects around clean energy. We also fund a lot of our work focuses on funding renewable energy projects and energy efficiency projects around the state. But our transportation program is a big part of what we do here at NYSERDA, even though it's a relatively small portion of the population here at NYSERDA. Transportation emissions make up between 35 and 40% of New York State's greenhouse gas emissions, and are a critical piece of meeting our long-term goals. New York State in 2019 passed a very aggressive greenhouse gas emission reduction law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and we are in the process of implementing the program now, the law. The first step is to identify the pathways and the policies that are going to help us get to our 2030 and 2050 goals. And that's something that we're in the middle of doing right now. Fortunately, on the transportation side, New York State is now and has been for a long time one of the most efficient transportation systems in the country, thanks in large part due to New York City and the MTA system and the amount of public transportation ridership there. But we have statewide policies that have helped to contribute to that as well. New York State has longstanding EV rebate programs and EV charging station programs and electric truck and bus programs. We have helped to establish car share and bike share programs in cities all across the state, not just the biggest cities. We have helped to enable car sharing, carpooling and ride sharing and things like that across the state. And there are some other great developments on the transit side and on biking and pedestrian. We've had longstanding complete streets rules in place. In addition to these, there were some very recent announcements. I think not this week that just ended, but the previous week that I'd really love to share with you, and I think tee us up for some great additional gains in the future. On the 16th of July, the Public Service Commission approved a $700 million program for utility investment in electric vehicles and transportation electrification. This includes over $500 million in support for light-duty EV charging stations across the state. It includes over $200 million targeted toward disadvantaged communities. It's about almost about $100 million targeted toward a combination of some prizes for transportation electrification in environmental justice areas, and some programs focused on medium and heavy duty vehicles, particularly trucks and transit buses. And NYSERDA is really excited to have a role to play in some of this. We're going to be managing a lot of the work in disadvantaged communities and around medium and heavy duty vehicles. In addition, the same day, we also announced about $50 million of new VW settlement money being available, including for both level 2 and DC fast charging EV stations for light duty vehicles, and incentives for electric transit buses and electric school buses. Also recently, in April, the state approved legislation that legalizes electric e-bikes and e-scooters, and they're starting to be rolled out in many communities across the state as well. So we're very pleased with how we've been doing as far as reducing transportation emissions. There's a lot more that needs to be done. I think we're well positioned to do more. There's certainly going to be some challenges coming out of the COVID crisis, and New York City obviously was hit very hard, and subway ridership and transit ridership are nowhere near where they were beforehand. But we're well positioned, and I think happy to talk more about this in the Q&A session. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Yes, we'll definitely address the COVID impacts in the course of the Q&A on transit and other factors. There's a lot of interactions with transportation and COVID, and we'll get to that. Dan, you want to talk a bit about Massachusetts?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Let's see if I can do this sharing of screen in a way that works. Is that working? It doesn't have anything embarrassing on my screen. Okay. Are you guys seeing what I'm seeing right now, this presentation? There we go. You guys all see this, right? Give me like a nod or, okay, great. Thanks everybody. My name is Daniel Gatti and I'm Director of Clean Transportation Policy for Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. This is, as some of you know, a pretty new position for me. I've only been at the job for a couple of months and I've yet to actually enter the office, which is a funny situation to be in, but it's an exciting opportunity. As some of you may know, earlier this year, Governor Baker committed the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to achieving net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. It's my job to help the state think through how we get to zero, or at least to net zero in transportation. Wanted to start today by just acknowledging the moment that we're in. The ongoing COVID-19 crisis has placed a spotlight on the importance of addressing air pollution, particularly in heavily impacted environmental justice communities. Pollution from our cars and trucks is a leading source of two of the most important pollutants impacting our respiratory health, particulate matter, particularly PM 2.5, as well as ultrafine particulates and nitrous oxide. These emissions are concentrated in urban areas, near highways and ports, and disproportionately in communities of color. Long-term exposure to these pollutants has long been tied to higher rates of asthma, COPD, and cardiovascular disease. PM 2.5 and nitrous oxide have now also been linked to higher COVID-19 death rates. But last year, while working for the Union of Concerned Scientists, I was part of an analysis that looked at where on-road transportation pollution is occurring throughout the Commonwealth. We found that communities of color face significantly higher emissions from transportation than white communities. Overall, non-white residents of Massachusetts are exposed to about a third more pollution from our cars and trucks than white residents. We also found that transportation pollution is concentrated in Metro Boston, in neighborhoods along highways such as Chelsea and Everett, and in gateway cities such as New Bedford, Fall River, Worcester, and Springfield. Today, many of these same communities have been the most heavily impacted by COVID-19. Here at EEA, we take our responsibility to reduce pollution and improve public health seriously, and we're currently considering a range of policies to reduce pollution from transportation with a focus on heavily impacted environmental justice communities. Of course, there are many things that we need to do to reform transportation in the Commonwealth. The Baker administration is exploring many different strategies and different kinds of investments to improve transportation in Massachusetts and address the interrelated concerns of climate change, congestion, resilience, and equity. Last year, the Future of Transportation Commission, convened by Governor Baker, took a look at many of the factors impacting transportation in the Commonwealth and released a report with a number of recommendations on improving transportation in Massachusetts. These recommendations included a number of steps to improve public transportation services, electrify our vehicle fleet, prioritize the movement of people over vehicles, encourage telework, support transit-oriented development, and reduce pollution from transportation. All of these investments are important. As we model how to achieve our net zero requirement for 2050, our modeling thus far shows that the majority of global warming emission reductions in transportation will come from electrification. This is consistent with other studies and jurisdictions that show high levels of electric vehicle penetration as necessary to achieving deep decarbonization by 2050. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail at a high level about electric vehicles and then get into a little bit more specifics as to what we're doing. I like to start with this image because I think it just says so much about the transition ahead of us, right? On the left, what you see there that I'm sure some of you are familiar with is the frunk of a Tesla Model 3. The front trunk, or frunk, is the empty space in the front compartment of an all-electric vehicle. The frunk is possible because the simpler mechanics of the electric motor simply don't require the same space or the same depth of complexity as the internal combustion engine. We've known that the electric motor is a more efficient strategy to produce locomotion, of course, since the invention of the AC induction motor by Nikola Tesla over 100 years ago. That's why we now have two auto manufacturers, Tesla and the electric truck company Nikola, both named after the Serbian engineer. That's the point that these companies are making by taking that name. The challenge, of course, is that 100 years ago, we did not have the battery storage capacity to give the electric car sufficient range for consumers. Today we do, or at least we're getting very close. If we were building our transportation system from scratch, there's no question that we would choose vehicles powered by the electric AC induction motors over vehicles powered by the internal combustion engine. The electric motor is simpler, more efficient, it's more powerful, it has fewer moving parts, it doesn't require the use of a complex transmission, and it produces no direct emissions and therefore has no need of an exhaust system or tailpipe. It's a better mousetrap. But of course, we're not building from scratch. Our existing transportation system is structured around the assumption of the internal combustion engine, and that assumption expresses itself in our development patterns, in our driveways, in our garages, in our bus, and in our commercial fleet depots. If we're going to make this transition happen, we're going to need a strong set of policies in place. That starts with continued improvement in vehicle emission standards coming out of the federal government and in California. The CAFE program and the Zero Emission Vehicle program are two of the most important programs that we have to influence the behavior of the auto companies. Protecting these programs from attack and then expanding them with post-2025 regulations that are consistent with our climate requirements will be essential to achieving the transition to EVs. We'll also need to think about how we expand our incentive programs, both to accelerate key parts of the vehicle market and to ensure that the transition to EVs doesn't leave some communities behind. In Massachusetts, we're beginning to look closely at how our EV incentive programs can be structured so that they can be more focused on achieving equity and reducing emissions in environmental justice communities. To that end, we're exploring new incentives to electrify delivery trucks and port vehicles, recognizing that nearly every part of our freight distribution system disproportionately impacts environmental justice communities. We're also considering new strategies to target low and moderate income drivers, particularly drivers of ride-hailing vehicles, home healthcare workers, and other high mileage drivers. And we're exploring the possibility of incentives for e-bikes as an alternative to car ownership. Of course, we'll need to figure out how we build and pay for the infrastructure to keep all these EVs charged. Keep all these EVs charged at an affordable rate. If you think about, for example, what it would take to upgrade an MBTA bus depot so that every spot has access to a level 2 or even a DC fast charger, it's a gargantuan investment. And then if you multiply that cost by all the other heavy duty fleet depots, thinking about both the public fleets and the commercial fleets, it quickly becomes clear that we're talking about huge costs that will be needed to make the EV transition happen. I believe the transition to electric vehicles will be good for ratepayers in the long run, so I think it's fair to ask ratepayers to contribute to the infrastructure needed to support the transition to EVs, and we've done some of that in Massachusetts, and we'll probably be doing more of it in the future. But it's also clear that as we achieve greater scale, we'll need major private sector investment in EV infrastructure. For that to happen, we need to look at our utility rate structures. We need to identify barriers to infrastructure investments such as demand charges, and we need to design rates that will encourage expanded investments. Finally, we need a way to enforce aggregate limits on transportation emissions. That's why Massachusetts is part of a group of states in a bipartisan collaborative effort to create a market-based program to reduce transportation emissions. This effort, taken through the Georgetown Transportation and Climate Initiative, is modeled after the highly successful Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that has the potential to create one of the largest markets in the world. TCI would improve our ability to reduce pollution in two critical ways. First, it would create an overall limit on the total quantity of global warming emissions from transportation. And second, it would provide a dedicated source of funding that would allow the state to scale up our investments in clean transportation and drive resources towards projects that will improve public health. Finally, as a new person working in state government for the first time, I want to say that this is an exciting time for clean transportation policy in Massachusetts. We have dedicated investments now from the legislature through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that will allow us to explore new programs in the near term, and with the potential of the Transportation and Climate Initiative coming to be able to allow us to scale up these investments. We have an administration in Massachusetts that is committed to making the EV transition happen and achieving net zero carbon emissions. So this is a time for new ideas and creative thinking, and we look forward to working with people and stakeholders on this webinar as we think about how best to move forward on these policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I was going to ask.
I don't have to give up my screen.
I was going to ask about TCI. That was one of my first questions. So let me on. All right, I had a small child want to intrude. So TCI is a Transportation Climate Initiative. It's a cap and invest program for carbon emissions from transportation fuels. It doesn't include everything. It doesn't include air travel, unfortunately, which is a significant source, but it does include road fuels. It includes gasoline and diesel to cap the carbon emissions specifically from these, although there are co-benefits in the reductions of VOCs and NOx and criteria pollutants. The initial focus of the program is climate, so carbon dioxide emissions. And cap and trade was used successfully to reduce SO2 emissions, which called acid rain, a very successful program launched in about 1990 to bring those emissions down very significantly at a much lower cost than industry had initially anticipated. And that's the reason why these market-based programs have some support. They're still facing a lot of challenges because by their nature, they do increase the cost of the fuels, but that doesn't account for the hidden costs that these fuels already impose on our health, on the climate, and everything else. So these market-based mechanisms seek to address that through applying a fee to the fuels, which is then used to incentivize clean transportation. Let's talk about what the states are doing on this front. So, as I understand it, it's a Northeast-based initiative, and some of the states are really out front, pushing hard for TCI to be successful, and some states take a more wait-and-see approach. So, Dan, sounds like Massachusetts is actively pushing for TCI to succeed and taking a lead role in that. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes, for sure.
And then Adam is New York also, I believe New York is also committed to the Memorandum of Understanding.
New York has been working very closely with the other states throughout the year, the last few years, frankly, on TCI and on the development of the policies. We've been a big part of TCI from the start in 2010, and are continuing to work with everyone. And obviously, no state can commit to adopting all of this yet because there isn't something to adopt yet. But all of us are monitoring it closely and working together to try to move it forward.
Yeah, the states are developing the rules that will govern this program. What's eligible for the investments coming out of it. How much investment should go to vulnerable communities, LMI communities. What sorts of things are eligible or not eligible to fund out of that.
And Pete, I would clarify that a little bit. There will, I think that whatever the program ends up looking like and whoever ends up signing on, there will be certain things that are the same across all the states and that are consistent across all the states, and there will be certain things that are left up to each individual state to handle. There are some very clear guidelines federally about what kinds of things states can and can't coordinate on, and so we'll obviously need to be taking into consideration those types of things. But yeah, there will be certain things that each state does on its own as well.
Dave, can you tell us a bit about Vermont's perspective here?
Similar as a smaller state, and I'm not speaking for the state of Vermont, but just from what I understand, there's certainly interest. They're participating in the process. They've signed on to the MOU, but are kind of still in the wait and see to hear more about the details and not ready to go it alone. So I think the state leaders are looking for other states to take some action on this to make it easier. I think, one of the upsides of current low gasoline prices is one of the concerns that's been voiced by many in Vermont is what about rural people who maybe have longer drives? It could be a regressive program for them if there aren't ways to reduce their costs and they're paying more for gas. But with gasoline as inexpensive as it is right now, those concerns don't go away, but they maybe are lessened somewhat. So, I guess for better or worse, it seems like those low gas prices are not going away anytime soon. So,
as Dan alluded to in his talk, in fact, explicitly mentioned, there's two components to TCI. One is the cap on carbon emissions from road fuels, gasoline and diesel, which manifests as a fee paid per gallon. And then there is how you spend that fee on the investment side. So both of those are levers that can improve clean transportation's competitiveness. But either the increase in the cost of gasoline and diesel or then using those funds to invest in clean transportation solutions. So there's two levers here, and it's possible that we could devote some of the investment side, to supporting those rural communities and giving them better options for clean transportation. I've been to a lot of these listening sessions. They've had them around all the different states, and people are suggesting some funding for transit and bike paths and all kinds of options. EV infrastructure is one of them, but not the only one by any means. So there's all kinds of efforts the states are looking at investing in with these proceeds from the fees. All right, it's a good overview of TCI. We can move on. So COVID, of course, the pandemic that has hit has impacted transportation in many ways. As Dan mentioned, the air quality impacts of transportation exacerbate the health impacts of COVID. So the respiratory health issue is really significant. Some of these are removed by clean transportation options, not all. Some PM10 is a factor of tires on the road, which does really not changed, but brake wear actually is less for EVs, as well as the engine emissions. So in that regard, the air quality impacts of clean vehicles would reduce the severity of COVID and other respiratory diseases. There's that dimension. There's the budget impacts on states, which again get a lot of their funds from gas taxes and things, so their budgets have been hit, and that impacts their ability to replenish the Vermont rebate. Kind of legislators just aren't meeting in some states. All their attention is focused on COVID recovery, not as much on EVs. And workplace charging, which we're looking to make a big push on at Plug in America. No one's driving to their workplaces right now. So, that's working from home, telecommuting does reduce emissions. When people go back to their offices, they're going to see some workplace charging. But I think the most important issue really is transit, and that is impacted by COVID. People don't want to be in confined spaces around a lot of other people without some assurance that they'll be fairly safe. Can you tell me anything about what states are doing in that regard? I've seen presentations on the relative safety of transportation in different metro areas where they have adequate practices for sanitizing the vehicles and requiring masks and everything else. Can you talk at all about what New York or Massachusetts are doing with the transit systems to encourage people to return to them?
So in New York, obviously, I think people probably seen news about how the MTA had, for the first time, shut down overnight for thorough cleaning every day. They've been aggressively enforcing mask wearing on the subways, and they've been adjusting how people are boarding buses and how they are spacing on buses and on subways. That's obviously a start, but and ridership is certainly up from the lowest points, but that's in part because the economy has started to open up a bit more, thankfully, and thankfully the COVID cases have continued to stay pretty low, relatively low in New York. Not as low as we'd like, obviously, but relatively low. MTA has a big task ahead of them, and as do other transit agencies, but as the biggest transit operator in North America, and it's a particularly acute challenge there. I can't say I'm familiar with all of their plans. I know that that's a full-time job of many people at MTA right now, but I think it is important to note that during this crisis, we've seen a lot more interest in a lot of other alternatives that are not just driving your car. I think it's been widely reported that biking has been increasing, e-bikes have become very popular, and I think it builds potential. It can potentially build a lot of momentum for things like complete streets and street diets and closing down streets to focus them on pedestrian and bike traffic and potentially buses. Shortly before all of the pandemic started, New York City shut down 14th Street in Manhattan, a major crosstown artery, to personal vehicles. And it's now only for buses and deliveries. And the speed of crosstown traffic, which is notoriously awful in Manhattan, it's about 2 miles per hour on average, which you can walk 2 miles an hour across town pretty easily. It picked up dramatically, and the people in the neighborhood who were initially opposed because they were skeptical that they'd be able to get where they needed to go, and that traffic at stores would be down, actually have been very pleased with it. So in that regard, I think you've seen other communities around the country shutting down some streets for more pedestrian access, for on-street dining, for biking. And I think we're going to see more of that. And I'm really optimistic that one ramification of this crisis is that people will recognize that providing more options, more non-motorized car options, is actually a really popular thing among residents, and a really popular thing among businesses, and can help to promote some of these other alternatives. We obviously need people to get back onto the subways and buses in New York City. Not everyone's going to walk or bike, but I think that's a potential co-benefit.
And,
Yeah.
and that's certainly the case. We have a near-term reprieve on our emissions to a degree from less car traffic and less air travel and so on. So our emissions have dropped and been able to devote, some car lanes to curbside dining and things like that, but less traffic overall. Not only is it a nicer pace of life, it's also less carbon emissions. So we have a bit of a reprieve here. We can try to capitalize on it when we come out of this pandemic with a cleaner system. Dan?
Yeah, no, it is funny how much all of these things are like, both good news and bad news at the same time. Good news for some aspects of the policy area, bad news for others. In this case, good news for telework for sure. I think it's going to be a real question. I think everyone in the Boston metro area is very aware that transportation and housing are real constraints on growth in Boston. And so, if telework can start to solve some of our congestion issues, and if especially since so many people are being thrust into it involuntarily, as we start to rebuild, are they coming back to driving into the office, or do they find new solutions? Can we think about, is there an opportunity there to think about staggering, time? I think there's a lot of possibility for sort of creative solutions right now in this space where, suddenly things have changed quite dramatically all at once. Of course, and certainly we've seen a lot of the same shutting down streets kind of opportunities too, which is, kind of an opportunity that you might only get every once in a while, right? I know that Somerville and Cambridge have worked together on kind of a whole integrated set of streets that have been shut down to kind of give connectivity for bike routes, and it's temporary, but maybe it's an opportunity for us to see what works, and to be able to keep it in the new as we rebuild.
This is an important issue for equity, as teleworking is mostly for white-collar jobs. A lot of people in Chelsea with the very high COVID rates have to go to their jobs. They cannot telecommute. They have to go into work in physical locations. A lot of blue-collar
Right.
jobs. So options that support them, whether it's transit or e-bikes or e-scooters and so on, maybe some lower-cost options than private car ownership could be very helpful to local communities who are impacted for multiple reasons, not only their air quality exposure, but also their lack of ability to telecommute. They just don't have jobs that work that way.
Totally, and actually, the Chelsea example is a great example of how the public space, the opportunity to maybe reset public space, could help too. We just were able to get BRT, dedicated bus lanes on the 111, which has been, such a problem for Chelsea residents for some time now. So, that's another place where, we knew we needed to move towards more dedicated bus lanes in order to be able to improve service, and maybe we've got an opportunity to.
We're now at the point for the public audience Q&A. We have a number of them already enter in the chat box or communicate to me. So I'll try to get through a few of them if we can. I'll take the first one that I see from Dave here, wanting to know about the growth rates of EVs to get into 2030, what we need to hit our net zero targets by 2050. And the point I'll make here is that exponential growth is a wonderful thing. If you've managed to invest in something with a good interest rate, exponential growth really helps you a lot. And I don't look at it as how many more EVs we need now than in 2030. We need 2030 than now. I look at the growth rate we need to hit that target. An annual growth rate of 40% would get us there. And we were on that track. And then we had kind of a flat year in 2019 and a down year this year. So we're gonna have to step up our game a lot from 2021 onwards to get to 50% growth a year to hit those targets instead of 40. And it sounds like a minor difference. It's actually quite a bit. The initial targets for the ZEV program were around 15% of new vehicle sales by 2025. With this downturn in vehicle sales overall, that'll be a tough challenge to hit that level of the ZEV targets. It might be doable, but for 2030, you just got to double our efforts and look at having growth rates of 50 to 60% a year to 2030. Now it sounds a lot less daunting than saying we have to increase by a factor of 10 our EV sales or 20 or whatever it is. Is doable as we see from international examples, which brings me to a question from Mike earlier about why do Europe and California have so much of a head start over us in this regard? And as Dan mentioned, that's policy. I want to take the question of why are Europe and the West Coast so far ahead, and how can we get there, which let us catch up by 2030 to our targets?
Sure. I could start. I mean, policy was my one-word summary of why. There are a lot of programs happening right now in California, that are more extensive than what you see in a lot of other states. There's no question about that. The low carbon fuel standard, in particular, is a big program that you only see in California and Oregon right now, and it's providing a pretty significant incentive, especially on the heavy duty side. You see very large incentive. Again, thinking primarily about the medium and heavy duty space, very large incentives coming out of California, a little bit less so in other places. In Europe, I think there's a lot of, really kind of transformative differences. A lot of European countries have a value-added tax, which gives the ability to have a EV incentive. Just exempting from the value-added tax can be a huge incentive in a lot of European cities.
Besides policy, there's price. So gasoline prices in the U.S. have always been fairly low by global standards, and California has higher prices, and Europe has much higher prices. And cheap gas is why we had big SUVs, and Europe had smaller cars, and why Europe's a hit on EVs. We have cheap gas here, and we have for a long time. Even when it was high by U.S. standards, it was still low by world standards. Price is a major driver of energy transitions. Just my dissertation. So that's a significant driver for Europe's lead on this. All right, there's a question for Dave about the availability of EV trucks, school buses, and scooters in Vermont. And EV pickup trucks with incentives would make a huge difference in this state.
Absolutely. So the Ford F-150 is the most registered vehicle in Vermont. It's one of the most popular vehicles in the country, and there really aren't any plug-in options widely available for that market segment at this point in time. But the good news is that most of the major automakers have announced plans to make all electric pickup trucks. Ford has also talked about a plug-in hybrid F-150, although the range has gone unmentioned. Tesla has announced their Cybertruck to some fanfare. It's pretty polarizing if you've seen it. The design is definitely unique. And Rivian is a Tesla-like company that is still in the process of building their factory out, but aims to be shipping pickup trucks and all-electric utility vehicles next year. So at least initially, those vehicles, it's hard to say what the price will be, and but the Rivian certainly does not look like it would be in that $40,000 realm that would make it eligible for the current state of Vermont incentive program, but would be eligible for federal tax credit and potentially other programs. So there are some things on the horizon, but hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years, we should see Chevrolet. They've announced that they're coming out with a Hummer. They're kind of bringing back the Hummer, love it or hate it, but it'll be all electric this time. So, you know, there will be more coming. And in terms of the larger trucks and school buses, those are out there. School buses, the state of Vermont is funding a pilot program to get 3 school districts going with 2 electric school buses each. So that is underway. The request for bids for the buses, I think, is currently out, I believe, and questions were due recently. So that is underway, and hopefully buses will actually be on the road in the next year or so. And we'll be learning from that. There's some other funds that the state is looking to invest from the Volkswagen diesel settlement on the heavier duty truck side as well. So completely agree that EV pickup trucks with incentives would be great in Vermont, and we're looking forward to the day we can be promoting those.
One point I might make there is that commercial vehicles might be appropriate for a different sort of price cutoff. You know, $40,000 is rather, if it is too low for an effective, adequate range pickup truck at this point, keep in mind the contractor trucks drive a lot of miles, and EVs save per mile. So even at the point of $60,000, you might still be saving money with an electric pickup truck if you're doing enough miles per year, because it costs less per mile to operate. So when you have a very high mileage commercial vehicle, it's a rather different situation than a personal vehicle. So maybe, you know, we can look at Vermont having some commercial incentives there for a lot of those pickup trucks, which are used by contractors.
Sure. Right now, the state incentive is only available for personal use vehicles, not for commercial, but there's certainly a great opportunity there, as you say. And the electric utility programs may also have some commercial, like right now they have their electric mower incentives, they have a different amount for commercial mowers for the same reasons you just made.
That's something to look at in the future. So one more question here, and we have at least time for one more. So Bill Libers asked about how the 3 states are handling funding for highways, since most of that money has come from a gas tax. I was actually on a board of the National Governors Association as a nonprofit that provides advice to the governors. It's a bipartisan group, or a nonpartisan group, I should say. And they had us look at this question of how do you fund transportation in a world of EVs when you don't have that gas tax revenue anymore? And at what point should EVs have to contribute their fair share? The gas tax revenue has declined as a share of the funding for highways for 2 major reasons. One is the failure to adjust it for inflation. Gas tax now does not keep up with the labor costs, material costs of building and repairing roads, because it's not been adjusted for inflation in most states in many years, and the federal one likewise. And then second of all, improving fuel economy, which is great for reducing pollution and climate change emissions, but also means less gallons of gas used per vehicle mile traveled, so less revenue to the states. And EVs are a tiny fraction of this shortfall. I believe Massachusetts has calculated they're around 0.2, 0.3% of the transportation funding shortfall is due to EVs. So you could tax all the EVs at $100 a year and it wouldn't make up the gap, which has been our stance at Plug in America on holding off on increasing registration fees until the EVs hit that target of 15% of vehicle sales. That's sort of been our take on it, and some states have agreed, yeah, it's just not worth developing a new policy to tax these vehicles to make up that highway fee until they're significant enough. It would cost more to develop the plan than you would get in revenue at the current state of the market in Maine or New Hampshire and so on. that being said, we do see a need for EVs to support the highway construction and maintenance, and we think a vehicle mile user fee is really the right way to go in the future, where passenger cars, which have a fairly small impact on road damage, are all just taxed on a per mile basis. Maybe if it's GPS based, you could even use some congestion pricing in there, saying if you're using, I-95 around Boston at these hours, we're going to charge you a little bit more to help affect some congestion pricing on that. That's an option. Tolling is good where you can do it, but many highways you just can't do tolling. But it really helps manage congestion, and it's easily adjustable with the new gantries. Like you have Easy Pass, you go through the gantry, it bills you. It's really no hassle. But states are looking at how to fund highways for a lot of reasons beyond EVs, for the reasons of inflation and fuel economy. Just how do you fund highways going forward? So that's something that all states have been looking at. And sometimes they try to blame EVs, but EVs is not the reason for that shortfall.
Yeah, Pete. One thing I would add to that is that in Massachusetts, EVs do pay the sales tax 6.25% here in the state,
Yep.
and EVs cost more. And when you look at the fact that what the cost differential is and the amount that EVs are paying in additional sales tax, you see that it exceeds the amount that EVs aren't paying in gasoline taxes. Now, that won't be true forever, because eventually, we're hoping that EVs are going to achieve cost parity with the internal combustion engine. But I certainly wouldn't want to impose any new costs on EVs while we're trying to make this transition right now, especially given that factor.
You make a good point that Katie sent her analysis on sales tax revenue to municipalities from EV purchases. And that's very significant. And, registration fees don't account for mileage and driving. If I was back when I was driving places, I had one EV that I used 15,000 miles a year, and the other EV is 3,000 miles a year. And, registration fee wouldn't capture that. They would just hit them both the same amount. So a mileage-based fee would really account for that better. Vermont looked at doing an electricity-based fee on all the kilowatt hours, and the utilities try to make the point it would cost them a fair amount to segregate out how much electricity goes to the EVs. They're looking at your household usage and isolating out from the signal, really, what's a level 2 charger. And that process of submetering itself carries a cost. And the utilities trying to say, let's not do it this way. And the legislature was fairly intent on, let's do it that way anyway. So we did our report and our recommendations, and I'm not sure what's happened with that.
It was, and so just so it's clear, this would be like the gasoline tax is a per gallon tax, so it would be like 1 cent per kilowatt hour extra on your EV charging bill. And legislators were talking about it earlier in the session, and they were planning to include a pilot program to try that out and see what those additional costs are in more detail. And then after COVID hit, they shifted to really focusing on more kind of essential issues. And so that got, at least for the time being, delayed. So it may come back, but for the time being, that's not in the transportation bill that passed at the end of June.
My preference is you self-report your mileage when you go to register your vehicle, and they just, you pay a fee based on how many miles you drove the past year. And you self-report, and people aren't going to cheat that much if they get, you audit 1% of them at the vehicle inspection, and people are generally honest enough. Quick question on V2G. V2G is vehicle to grid. That's the ability to use the vehicle's electricity to power or return energy back to the grid, use it as storage. As with many things, it's technically possible. The question is there a market for it? Is there enough value in that service being provided? I think there's great value in off-grid backup during a power outage, during an emergency, to power your home. And the Nissan Leaf can do that in Japan, and they're working on doing it in the US. They have that capability, vehicle to home. When you're grid connected, the grid itself is pretty flexible already with hydro and flexible gas plants and so on. There's not a lot of dollar value in connecting to the grid, and you have to go through interconnection processes from the utility. But it could be done if there was a value proposition there. I think the best use case is off-grid, like during a power outage. But I know some of the school bus programs are looking at doing it for solar storage. When the school bus is parked during the day and the sun is shining, to store that solar energy for the the late afternoon when it's needed.
There's also opportunities, sometimes it's called vehicle to building. So a lot of larger commercial customers have peak kilowatt demand charges. So residential typically in the East doesn't have that, but you get charged for each kilowatt, not kilowatt hour, but kilowatt. So this is power, not energy we're talking about. And it's possible that these V2G types of systems can help shave those peak demand charges on a large commercial customer, and it could end up saving them thousands of dollars, or a lot of money. So there's definitely opportunities there as the technology continues to be refined.
I would agree with that, Dave, and I think that's it, especially in places with high demand charges like New York City. I think that's a real good opportunity. I would also just say V2G is one flavor of managed charging. And there are a lot of other flavors, from very low-tech kind of passive time of use rates to a little bit more complicated, where a utility could throttle back a charge but not necessarily pull energy out of a battery from a car, to full-scale V2G. And I think that some of those managed charging as a category is very important, and something that we need to do a lot more of and figure out how to enable. But I think there are a lot of steps before V2G that are going to be a lot more economically viable and more broadly impactful nearer term.
The time of use is great. A lot of the other ones have done small scale pilots where the transaction costs of implementing it were fairly high compared to the revenue that they received. So until we can find ways to bring those costs down at scale, I think time of use is the way to go for now. But there could be other options in the future, especially if there's more renewables on the grid, more wind and solar, and we need those grid services to help support them. It's a good tool to have available. All right, I believe that is our time. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Dave and Dan and Adam. That was great. And anyone who has further questions, I can try to get them done on email. Thank you very much.